Well, welcome everyone to the Herbert C. Kelman seminar. This seminar it is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. And we're just so happy that there's so many of you from all over the world who have chosen to be with us today. We know you've got very busy schedules, so to take the time out to spend an hour with us today, we're really grateful. And I want to also thank our team. We have a great team here on this seminar. Nicole Bryan, of course, is the managing director of the Program on Negotiation, Diane Long, and James Kerwin. We all work together on making this seminar happen. And we are thrilled today to have Dr. Floyd Cobb and Dr. John Krownapple present their, I think, path-breaking work on reframing diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And they use a dignity approach, and they're going to be telling you all about that and how effective it has been for them and for the people with whom they work. So we have an exciting hour ahead of us. I want to also tell you that this session is being recorded. So if you want to see it, see it at a later date and maybe tell your friends about it, you can go on the Program on Negotiation website in about a week. It takes about a week to get the thing up, and you'll see if you click on events and Herbert C. Kelman seminar, you'll see it there. So I would like to introduce our guests and our speakers for today. Dr. Floyd Cobb has over 20 years of experience spanning the P20 educational continuum, 15 of which have been leadership roles. He's held roles as a classroom teacher, school district curriculum leader, and a statewide policy implementer. In each role, he's held responsibilities as a key leader, making educational experiences more equitable. Floyd holds a PhD in curriculum and instruction from the Morgridge College of Education at the University of Denver. There, he's an adjunct faculty member and teaches courses on social inequality. He's also an adjunct faculty member, and he also teaches these courses on inequality through a lens of race, class, and gender. In 2017, Floyd was awarded the Ruth Murray Underhill Teaching Award for Excellence in Teaching, which is given to one adjunct faculty member at the university. He has published numerous articles and book chapters in addition to Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. Dr. John Krownapple specializes in organizational development, and professional learning focuses on equitable change. He's over 15 years experience as the coordinator of diversity, equity, and inclusion for an organization of over 6,000 employees serving over 50,000 students. John has published numerous articles and is the author of the book Guiding Teams to Excellence with Equity, Culturally Proficient Facilitation, and co-author of Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity. He's had served as a classroom teacher, curriculum specialist, and district administrator. John is currently an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University and educational consultant. So what the format here of this seminar is that they will present for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will open it up for a Q&A. And please put your questions in the Q&A function. And I will take a look at them and deliver the questions to our speakers. And so again, thank you so much for being here with us. And without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Floyd and John.
Greetings, everyone. We're excited to be with you today to have this conversation. I'm John Krownapple, and I'm coming to you from Maryland, just outside of Washington, D.C. And our topic today is going to be centered around what we here in the U.S. at least often refer to nowadays as diversity, equity, and inclusion. We can think of it as full inclusion, social inclusion. And what we are attempting to do today is to provide an alternate frame or a reframe when it comes to common implementation. So as I mentioned, I'm here in Maryland, and I'm going to turn it over to Floyd here to introduce himself.
Good morning, everyone. I'm coming to you from Colorado, so it's very nice to see everyone tuning in from all over the globe. So thank you all very much for taking the time to be here.
We have some contact information here, just in case you're on Twitter. You could find us. Their email addresses. We'll put this back up at the very end in case you want to keep in touch. We're going to start the program here, or the talk, with a parable that's been shared for hundreds of years, if not longer. There's a modern telling of it that's called the streetlight effect. And the way it's told nowadays in its more modern telling, it has a person late at night crawling around on a sidewalk underneath a streetlight. And along comes a police officer. The police officer says, "Hey, what are you doing down there? Can I help you out?" And the person says, "Well, I'm looking for my keys. I lost them. I can't find them anywhere." So the officer gets down on the hands and knees, crawls around, and very quickly notices there are no keys here. There's not even a storm grate where they could have fallen down. There's no way there are any keys here. So the officer asks, "Are you sure you lost your keys here?" And to that, the person said, "Oh, no, I didn't lose my keys here. I lost them down the road in the park." And kind of in a bewildered manner, the officer says, "Well, why are you looking here if you lost your keys there?" And the person responds, "Well, this is where the light is. It's dark down there." And as ridiculous as that story sounds, like, why would someone be looking for something in this area where they know, they didn't lose their particular item? It really illustrates this very human tendency of ours that's referred to as observation bias. Our tendency to look for answers to our problems in the areas where everyone else is looking. So what tends to fall under the streetlight are things like buzzwords, trends, quick fixes, easy answers, rush solutions, packaged programs, etc. And we make the argument that the answers to our social conflicts when it comes to what is referred to as diversity, equity, and inclusion, we're not going to find it under the streetlight. We're not going to find it with trendy terms. We're not going to find it with the latest fads. What we need to do is explore the darkness where the keys actually are. And it's with that we introduce in our book what you see right here, which is referred to as the dysfunctional cycle of equity work. From here, I'm going to turn it over to Floyd to lead us through this.
Great. Well, as we talk through this, and while certainly John and I come from an American context, I would invite you to think about this as it relates to just any form of social conflict that might emerge within any of your local contexts. Certainly, as Americans, we have our own historical context in terms of the issues that we are dealing with, and we're constantly trying to improve that. But certainly within your own locality, I can imagine that there are plenty of examples where, regardless of the difference, these ideas might come into play. And typically what we see is that this four-phase process where there's a catalyst or an issue, a commitment to an attempt to commit to address the problem, and then we run into problems with implementation, which then leads us to the inequitable status quo. And typically what happens is that there's a catalyst, some big event, right? Some social event that emerges in the United States in 2020. I think there was a number of incidents that emerged that drew attention to this overall conversation of the magnitude of inequality. And what it does is it puts into focus these general topics of injustice, inequity, and exclusion. And in putting those words in there, we are always deliberate to talk about the focus on the negative frame here in terms of the things that we don't want around, not these, and what it leads to ultimately is statements from leadership talking about this is not who we are. And it oftentimes will lead to a level of skepticism, regardless of the environment. We can see it in corporations, we can see it in educational settings, we can see it in state governments, it doesn't matter. But these statements emerge around this isn't who we are. And people who have been impacted by this will look at it with a level of skepticism, and people who are interested in addressing to solve the problem will be excited about it. But ultimately, where these statements wind up creating challenges is that they wind up having this sort of general absence of a shared vision. And a lot of times when we start thinking about this in terms of an absence of a shared vision is that they really begin to focus on what's wrong, as opposed to focusing on the place that we want to go or the place that we want to be. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about and discussing is the fact that people can be against something for very different reasons. But in order to be for something, there's got to be shared agreement. And when there isn't that form of shared agreement for where we're working towards, it allows for factions and frustrations to emerge. And typically what will happen, as this work comes about, we see this a lot, and sometimes we're even invited to give talks related to these particular issues, in corporations. And what we tend to see a lot of times happens is that the dominant approach emerges from really trying to focus on concepts that emerge from upper levels of academia, and lots of talks related to the history of inequality and how those circumstances might remain. And ultimately, what kind of happens as a result of this sort of speaker series circuit that emerges is that there becomes this sort of fissure that emerges. One of some people saying, hey, that was great, that was wonderful, that was what we needed. And then the others starting to feel sentiments of blaming and shaming. And ultimately after that, what can emerge is after the speaker series sort of come and go, the questions we start to ask ourselves is, okay, now what? What is going to happen? Where are we going to see some form of change? And when those easy answers don't reveal themselves, this is what brings us back to that street light that John had talked about. And when we kind of start looking under the street light, and there aren't these easy answers, we will start to ask of the folks who started this initiative to just simply tell us what to do. And a lot of times those answers wind up being evasive. And in the worst case examples, what it leads to is this movement towards essentialism, if you would, kind of reducing people to generalized stereotypes, reducing people to these myths in these ideas, and saying that all people in this group do X or all people in that group do Y. And that becomes the sort of general movement which begins to further create mistrust. And this becomes the kind of typical way that things happen until it begins to dissipate, which then ultimately could lead to another incident, because the nature of the world is that there will always be conflict. But ultimately, and then what this will do is kind of lead us to a focus of these same ideas of injustice and equity and exclusion. But this time around, what emerges is people have history. People have schema with our past experiences, and there becomes this conflict. And here in the United States, we're very much seeing a lot of this conflict emerge right now. And it kind of brings us right back to this point. And so that in and of itself is an explanation of how we see these incidents kind of revealing themselves over and over in a very, very short version of a logic model. We oftentimes will talk about the way this works in terms of typically a lot of times people will kind of focus on diversity and equity inclusion by doing these things, right? That if we train people by hiring guest speakers to talk about race and mandating implicit bias training and teaching on vocabulary and concepts and listening to stories of colleagues excluded, then alone, those things will wind up changing behaviors, and the concerns that we have will somehow disappear. And what John and I have realized through firsthand experience, lots of it, trying to figure this out and trying to make this work, that it winds up not happening in that regard. And what I'm going to invite John to do is to talk to us about the way that we've tried to conceptualize these ideas at a more human level in terms of focusing on the things that we'd like to see.
So we have these three keys. They're the keys that are in the darkness. They're the keys that we believe that if we are able to remain focused on them in terms of improvement efforts related to our organizations, to our community, related to our society, or related to individuals that are engaged in conflict, if we can stay centered on these concepts, we have a much better opportunity of actually making progress and of creating environments within which people are able to thrive. So we have actually a process model that we use. This is a mental map that Floyd and I use, regardless of what we're doing. The overall figure eight shape represents the process that we help guide groups through. And what you see is a very specific iteration of this process because there are 6 unique steps. This represents the iteration that we use when we're helping teams and groups of people actually work on improving their organization. So you can see at the bottom of the screen here, there's a past, present, future dynamic in place here. The process couples the notion of awareness and action. It doesn't withhold action or make it contingent upon people getting on board or becoming aware. These two concepts actually work hand in hand, they're coupled. So the question in the center reflects a commitment to inclusion. How inclusive are we? This represents the idea that we actually want to get better. We actually want to live together. We want to create an environment where we all can thrive, where we all belong. And so what the arrow to the left here implies is that it begins with looking in the rearview mirror to figure out who among us to this point has experienced a lesser sense of belonging. And we can do things like assess the climate. We can disaggregate our data. We can try to find specific groups of people that are experiencing a lesser sense of belonging within our environment, be it a community, an organization, or some other form of people gathering together. If we're able to do that, then we can drill down and we can activate our empathy. We can exercise our empathy muscles. We can conduct empathy interviews, all in the spirit of identifying and defining a specific narrow problem, a specific belonging challenge, if you will, that we can then turn our gaze toward the horizon of a better tomorrow and center the concept of dignity in the process of addressing that problem. And there are design thinking steps here that may be familiar to you if you're familiar with that particular model, where we brainstorm or ideate, then we prototype a treatment, then we get feedback on that treatment, we put it into play, and then we return back to step 1 with assessing the overall climate. Are we indeed improving the conditions within our environment so that specific groups of people feel better about being here while we're simultaneously improving the overall culture and climate for everyone. And so if we look at the 3 keys that are hanging on that process model, the very first one is that we need a shared vision of inclusion. As Floyd mentioned, it's actually easy to be against something. It's really easy. People might seem united being against an injustice, but the reality is that people can be against that injustice for any number of reasons. It does not require agreement. It doesn't require negotiation. It requires simply saying, I don't like that. I'm against that. I stand against that. That doesn't say anything about what you stand for. And in order to move forward as an organization, which is simply a group of people organizing around a purpose, there requires an agreement about where we are headed in order to make any progress. Now, sometimes this word gets thrown around a lot in these conversations. We make the point that diversity does not represent a vision. At best, it represents the reality in any relationship or in any organization, when you have more than one people, you have differences between and among us. So the real issue or the real focus of this type of work is how are we responding to the differences that are present, within our relationship or within our community. And to illustrate this point, we have four diverse environments. There are differences present in some way, shape, or form in all of these. So it's not the presence of differences that's the issue, it's the response. And we put language to these that clearly represents the experiences of the folks who are on the receiving end of the exclusionary forces that might be in play. So for instance, you see the excluded experience. There are a bunch of squares of various colors within a square culture. And if you don't meet that specific criteria for belonging, then you're out. Then we have the segregated experience, the integrated experience, and the included experience. Now we tap into mathematical thinking here to make the argument that there are two primary dimensions that we need to pay attention to. And the first one is access. It's fundamental to social equality that we address access. However, there is something beyond access that Professor John Powell out of UC Berkeley refers to as belonging. It lies beyond access. And really, belonging is what ends up directing or even dictating the quality of experiences that people have once they are in an environment. So if you look at the excluded quadrant, here we have the intersection of conditional belonging and low access. If you don't meet the conditions to belong, then you're out. Not only are you out, you are less than. And then in the segregated or separated experience, it's the same exclusionary force that is at play. However, what is different is people can start to form a community as a manifestation of human resilience. In order to meet the needs for safety, the needs for belonging, people come together and form community and even identity in the pockets that form on the margins. Now, so this implies that this experience involves a mixture of negative and positive experiences. And it's true. However, the point we always make is in an organization that is committed to democratic ideals, it simply isn't good enough. Likewise, neither is the integrated frame in the upper left-hand quadrant. In an organization that commits itself to principles of humanitarian principles, social equality principles, democratic principles, the integrated experience represents people being in the culture, but not everyone is of the culture. So the conditional belonging remains so that the pressure to fit in is high. And the tradition within this experience is that the pressure to fit in causes people to change or hide important aspects of themselves, sometimes lose or undermine themselves and their ancestry, their history, their culture, their tradition, all in the spirit of leveraging the access that's available within that environment. So the tradition is the more I'm able to melt, the more I'm able to blend in, the more I'm able to fit in, the better I'm able to leverage the access I have available being in the environment. So the upper right-hand quadrant represents the only one of these particular quadrants that provides a vision for a better tomorrow based on social equality, where we have a more expansive we, where we all belong, we all have access. And you can see the squiggly line defining the culture. What that represents is that it's the people that are here at this moment that are engaging with one another to co-create the thing that they're joining, which is very, very different than fitting into the thing that you're joining. Now, if you notice the dotted square around, the group, what that represents is the history. We're never going to forget who we were. We're never going to forget the exclusionary forces that were at play. And when Floyd and I were conceptualizing this, I couldn't get out of my mind a trip to Berlin, Germany in 2010. When I walked around downtown, it just struck me that it was by design that people that were there would never forget what happened during World War II, what happened in the Holocaust. I couldn't walk a block or two without seeing names in the pavement or other types of memorials to what had taken place. So we're never going to forget that we were a square culture, but we are going to engage with one another right here and now to co-create the thing that we're doing. And we have some markers of these two experiences. On the left-hand side, conditional belonging is defined by degradation, mistreatment, dismissal, and rejection. And then on the right-hand side, unconditional belonging is defined by appreciation, fair treatment, validation, and acceptance. From this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Floyd to take the reins.
So as we look at this idea, we always want to make sure that we can talk about these features revealing themselves through a number of different identities. We can think about any of these concepts on the left, where they reveal themselves in terms of one's experience being excluded or included or segregated or integrated. It really doesn't matter. Sometimes we want to narrow these ideas down to one particular identity, but what we do know is that so much of the work that we're trying to focus on has to do with human emotion. And what John and I have tried to really focus on is just the human emotions that are experienced when it comes to having an experience of being excluded. And so when we do our talks in person, we ask people to share stories about their experiences in terms of any one of those quadrants. And inevitably, we will get a lot of the words on the left-hand side whenever it's talking about the things on the negative, right? Where you're talking about people feeling fear and envious and constrained, but ultimately talking about this sort of general feeling of humiliation. And on the right-hand side, whenever we ask people about their experiences in an included environment, even if it's only temporary, people will oftentimes share their experiences of being safe and fun and appreciated and validated and accepted. And we've identified these ultimately as two concepts of othering and belonging. And so when we talk about our second key, we really want to push on this idea of why belonging is so important in a way to make sure that we continue to keep this front of mind. And as John had mentioned, we have borrowed the ideas of John Powell, who has done a significant amount of work in terms of helping to educate us around the importance of belonging, right? Because it really, means to be fully human, right? And entails this sort of basic respect to be able to co-create and make demands upon a society. And I oftentimes say that when you belong somewhere, you don't feel like you're having to always ask for permission to be able to do things. I would say you can go into the refrigerator and you can take food. And we know that belonging is important from our hierarchy of needs. In our text, we spent a lot of time talking about how our hierarchy of needs can be met via a staircase as opposed to the traditional pyramid where one has to precede another. So we have physiological needs, safety needs, belonging needs, esteem needs. We put achievement because achievement is an esteem need before we can get to self-actualization. And what we've realized is that so many of the challenges, certainly that led to the catalyst that we saw in the United States, were oftentimes questions of belonging that emerged, whether it was the circumstances that you could perhaps gained national and perhaps even sometimes international attention related to behaviors or conflicts or interactions. They always wound up reducing themselves back to conversations of belonging. And so John and I used our definition of belonging to really get clear in terms around the extent to which people feel personally appreciated, validated, accepted, and treated fairly within an environment. And really trying to focus on this idea of conditional belonging as being something that we have to pay attention to and something that we're mindful of in terms of the ways that conditional belonging can create harm. And so for oftentimes what we wind up seeing is that the way that we wind up experiencing or understanding these ideas is that in order to truly belong, oftentimes there's a requirement in some respects for people to actually achieve or to produce something before they're able to do so. And what we oftentimes comment on is the fact that that doesn't actually get to belonging, right? What it does is it forces people to fit in. And when people don't belong, A lot of times we wind up trying to fix challenges on the back end, particularly in our educational spaces, right? We will think about the things that we're trying to solve on the back end, but what we realize is that the things that we need to be focusing on are the things on the front end, which has to do with truly identifying how we can remedy the lack of belonging, as opposed to trying to discourage people from joining any of these particular circumstances. And so what we want to do is pay very close attention to making sure that we're clear around what our gaps in belonging are. And when we can get clear about what our gaps in belonging are, we can begin to move forward, which is part of the reason why we advocate so heavily for the assessment of climates, to really get a clear understanding of who belongs or who feels as if they belong and who doesn't. Now, as we get into our third key around taking action to honor dignity, we certainly are grateful for the work that Donna has done and have relied heavily on her model to really thinking about dignity as our inherent value and worth, right? And thinking about that as a concept that we all desire and crave, no matter who we are and no matter where we are. And we know that as human beings, we can only do one of two things, which is to honor or to violate dignity. And one of the challenges that we have oftentimes is being able to do so. That's a very difficult thing. It is not an easy thing for any of us to be able to do. And we have to do our very best to keep those ideas front of mind in whatever endeavor we attempt to do. And what I'm going to do now is turn this over to John, who's going to talk to us a little bit about how dignity reveals itself in our current context, as well as through a model that we've been able to create to help explain this conversation.
We just use a few examples from Twitter here just to illustrate, at least here in the United States, when we're looking at current events, the presence of dignity is always there, whether it's explicitly stated or whether it's implied, or whether it's a manifestation of false dignity. It's always there within current events that deal with exclusion, injustice, inequity in terms of our current social context. So you have, for instance, within the Black Lives Matter movement, all of the names that people unfortunately have learned because of the indignant treatment and sometimes state-sanctioned violence. We have a rise in the United States of anti-Asian hatred and bias and harassment. And we have a tweet there from Ben Chang saying every person deserves to be treated with dignity. Then we have an example on the right-hand side that actually deals with events of January 6th and some quotes about, basically who deserves to be treated with violence and who doesn't, being a very explicit illustration of the notion of false dignity. So when it comes to applying some of these ideas, and Floyd mentioned our gratitude for Donna Hicks and her work in terms of making this idea operational, what we've put together over the years is a framework that we use for better promoting and nurturing the concept of belonging. And we feel like it's helpful in terms of reframing some of the common implementation that falls under the label of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so I'm going to walk us through this. It has three components. The first of the components are dispositions for dignity: listening, empathy, patience, and openness. Now, these are qualities that we could nurture within ourselves and within our organizations that make it a lot easier to honor dignity. As a matter of fact, these end up in and of themselves becoming dignifying actions. For example, truly listening to someone is extending a dignifying act. But developing these qualities end up making it a lot easier to honor dignity as a normal and part of our existence and our relationship. And the second component are the indicators of belonging. This gives us language to help operationalize the concept. We can measure the degree to which people are experiencing these as we try to put in place metrics that help us move forward with creating organizations where we are experiencing what is referred to as equity or social inclusion. And then finally, we have 4 standards that can serve as guideposts for behaviors, practices, and policies. The extent to which we are building partnerships and community, the extent to which we're repairing harm and restoring the relationship when things go sideways, and there always will be conflict when we are in relationship. It's not the absence of conflict that's a marker of a healthy relationship. It's actually how we navigate our way through things. And a big part of that is our ability to repair the harm and restore the relationship. We have appreciating differences and uniqueness. Certainly that entails appreciating who people are and who they say they are. It also entails recognizing and showing appreciation for what people do. And then we have presuming competence and positive intent. And at its core, it really gets back to one of Donna's 10 essentials, which is lending the benefit of the doubt. Altogether, it creates these elements all work together to help us better learn how to honor dignity. And we have a flip side to this, which helps us recognize the unhealthy components in our environment, the unhealthy practices, behaviors, policies, and procedures. What we've learned over the past 3 years as we've been using this framework is that this side of the framework is very helpful. It's very helpful because it helps people develop a shared language where they can better identify the things that are going on in their organization that they don't want, that they want to get rid of. And it helps also better measure the concept of othering, which is the manifestation of the violation of dignity. People feeling otherized or degraded, people feeling dismissed, people feeling marginalized or rejected, and people feeling mistreated. And so just to put it in simple terms, what we're really offering here is a framework to help get more of what is on the left-hand side and more of what is on the right-hand side. Floyd's going to talk to us a little bit about the importance of procedural justice within this conversation.
So as we think about just the overall reframe, we want to just be mindful of this general idea rather of just procedural justice in terms of the thing that we as human beings all desire, especially in terms of public accommodation, right? That, we want to know whenever a policy is being put forward, that we understand it. We want to feel like it's being, that it's designed in a fair way. We certainly want to ensure that there's opportunity for voice, for people to share their perspectives on it, and then really to be able to make sure that people are being treated with dignity in terms of human value and worth. And in many times we think about kind of what has been sometimes reactions to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We want to think about it in terms of the Cartman drama triangle, where there are 2 perspectives on a particular issue. And there's a bystander who's looking to be persuaded one way or the other in terms of what's being provided, and ultimately is asking whether or not what's either being provided or denied is fair. And if we were to think about that, in many cases, in many respects, as it relates to so many of the current conversations that are happening in the United States, we certainly can say that we see some of this dynamic revealing itself in terms of so many of the conversations that are happening within our local school board levels, in terms of just the ongoing conflicts and the ongoing fighting. And so as John and I have thought about this work, we really wanted to kind of keep our eyes focused on the work that we're doing in terms of a fork in the road, right? That we have to be mindful of what we're doing in our efforts to achieve our goals, to not go down the road of false dignity, right? Not go down the road of essentialism, and not go down the road of flattening people into a singular dimension where they're treated as a stereotype. And sometimes that's not always easy, but the road to progress, regardless of the environment in which we're living, regardless of the negotiation that we're having, really needs us to get to humanity. And John and I have been mindful of Glassell's stages of conflict escalation, where we have to continue to keep in mind that we have to do our very best to keep things at the lowest levels where there's opportunities for win-win. Because at the end of the day, what we do know is that what people are looking for, regardless of the conflict, regardless of the circumstance, regardless of the situation, is people ultimately want these 2 things, right? Whenever there's a conflict, people want to be acknowledged, as Donna talks about, for the suffering that they've endured. And they want to be, they want for accountability to happen, right, in terms of just a form of responsible action to be able to remedy the challenges that they faced. And with these ideas, John and I have found some success in our efforts to be able to reframe this topic and reframe this debate. And we hope that, in the short time that we've had with you this morning in sharing these ideas, that some thoughts have emerged, or even some questions might have come up in terms of how to perhaps think a little bit differently about all of the challenges we face that are human challenges, in terms of making sure that we can do our very, very best to continue to coexist. And so with that, I think I will turn it back over, I believe, to you, Donna,
Yes.
and be available for any questions you might have.
All right, I'm trying to get my video started again. Diane, maybe you can help me. I'm not coming up. Let's see, the host has asked you to start your video. Okay, excuse me, folks. I just have a little technical difficulty here for 1 second. Well, let me say, John and Floyd, that, I think what is so powerful about what you're doing and the way you're framing this work is that, typically DEI work is a sort of educational enterprise, in the sense that we're trying to, expose biases and try to understand, all of these internal mechanisms. But I think framing it the way you have, it really does lead to healing and to resolving these deep, deep conflicts. There are certainly cultural conflicts here. There are conflicts all over the world. And I think if this framing of yours, I like to think of it now as a conflict resolution approach, not just DEI work, but it really, the fact that it does promote healing, people do feel acknowledged. People feel, like some accountability has been offered them. So congratulations, I just want to say that. We have some questions here, Floyd and John. Let me, if I can get into I don't know what's wrong with sorry, let me just get this. My colleague, Cynthia Geyer, who was the director of Global Dignity, she wants to know how you started framing this as dignity. What inspired you? Because she's all over this dignity word here of yours. So John and
so thank you for the question. It was a interesting, a backwards way of getting there, to be honest with you. There was a point in time where I was engaged in a lot of work and a lot of research and a lot of personal reflection. And I had spent a significant amount of time studying humiliation, and just kind of understanding the pain that I was feeling in terms of how social exclusion really forced this feeling of humiliation. And so I spent a lot of time studying, getting into humiliation studies as a concept. And what that led to was, again, similar to synonyms and antonyms, as a writer, wanting to find the antonym of humiliation, and came to find dignity. And through some time and through some reflection, it became really clear to me that I was like, this is what has been missing in our conversation related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I was with my daughters one day at an aquarium, and I was texting John via Twitter, and he, the question was, when we were going to finally sit down and be able to write something. And I said, I've got an idea, and this is what I think we should do. And it kind of took off from there.
I think I was at an amusement park when you texted me. we were with our kids. I remember I started working in what is referred to as DEI work, right? Being a supervisor and someone tasked with teaching and professional development focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that was 2006 formally is when I stepped into that role. And I was lucky enough to have some just incredible mentors that helped me focus on and understand the importance of focusing on what you want to create. And I had some mentors, Brenda Campbell-Jones, Franklin Campbell-Jones, Randy Lindsay, who told stories of how commonly people focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion tend to focus on the thing that they are against, and how powerful it is, the power of remaining focused on what you want to create. And so with Floyd's, exploration of humiliation and recognizing the function of racism and other forms of exclusion, leading to this point of just really making it crystal clear that at the core of all of it, what we are for is dignity. That is it. And so it was, I'm getting like goosebumps even talking about it. It was nothing short of magical just to experience that type of clarity.
Wonderful. Great stories. Thank you, Floyd and John. W. Robert Pearson has an interesting question for you. How do you get past the almost automatic reaction of shame and blame when past truth and present need for community change come into the conversation?
Yeah, this is always a hard thing to be able to work through, and it's not something that I think that John and I have the simple answer for, but really always kind of going back to those two things that we talked about at the end. We realize that so much of the conflict begins to escalate when there's an absence of acknowledgement. And so when we engage in this conversation and we don't acknowledge the shame that people feel based upon either the history that has happened or experiences that they may have had with respect to any of this work, it doesn't create an avenue for a path forward. It just moves us up or down, whichever version of Glassell's model you want to use, escalation of conflict. And at the end, it just leads to just sort of mutual destruction. And again, we have one planet, right? There's nowhere else we're all moving to. And we're here for a limited amount of time. And we need to do our very best to figure out how we can coexist, understanding that we'll have differing perspectives at times.
My friend and colleague, Mika Estrada, who was also one of Herbert Kelman's students, we spent a lot of time together here at Harvard working with Herb. She has a very interesting point about shame, John and Floyd. She said, leading with an affirmation that maintaining the relationship is essential relaxes the nervous system and helps to drop the fight and flight shame experience. Just wondering if either one of you want to comment on that.
We help people understand sometimes what's going on with the nervous system, and in particular what Daniel Goleman referred to in the 90s as the amygdala hijack, and just how we may be able to mitigate that effect. And we try to make the dispositions in our framework, we try to help them have utility value with folks, and they overlap, of course. Listening overlaps with empathy. Openness overlaps with listening. But one example of this in terms of developing the capability to stay in a conversation is developing awareness of the feedback triggers that you have. Just when we were writing this excellent book called Thanks for the Feedback by Doug Stone and Sheila Heen came across my desk, and it really is exceptional in terms of helping people become better receivers of feedback. I have tons of books on giving feedback, but that particular one, they named 3 feedback triggers. And I think they are very easily activated. They're truth triggers, relationship triggers, or identity triggers. They're very easily activated, and they just close us down, and they get us into that shame, those feelings of shame, and helping folks identify that, and monitor them, and mitigate them, become helpful for people staying in the conversation. Because ultimately, this question that was posed just before that about the conversations leading to shame, it's like there always is going to be feedback in the conversation around inclusivity, because that implies that there has been some group or some people excluded or mistreated. So there has to be truth telling, and that's one manifestation of feedback. And so being able to stay in, if we're able to develop openness as a disposition, we're more able to actually participate and not check out of the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks so much. Amy Tedisco wants to, she said, I'd love to hear some real world stories, applications of this work. Thank you. Can you tell a story about a time where you applied it?
Yeah, there's been several. I mean, I think there's actually one that, we talk about even in our book, where there was like a real firsthand experience that just sort of jumped out at us, where we were engaging in a talk and having people share their own experiences. And we had two people who, in an odd way, were both feeling unsafe, but at the same time, both feeling unsafe in the environment, but then both feeling unsafe with one another. And anytime you engage in a conversation in at a conference or something like that, you only have a limited amount of time. And we had this option, right, to kind of fight or flight, so to speak, where we could have changed the direction of our presentation and engaged and applied the ideas and concepts, or just ignored it and just continued to move forward. And it was a really sort of powerful moment that we didn't anticipate or predict would emerge at one time, but it was something that we lived with specifically. And I think beyond that, we certainly had plenty of experiences in terms of a number of just school leaders who've just done a tremendous job at applying this principle, because it was something that people could wrap their arms around as something, again, to move towards, right? One of the things that I oftentimes talk about in terms of this work is that I think part of the reason why diversity, equity, and inclusion work can be so slow to move forward is that because the language comes out of academia, it's complex. It's hard to be able to recite, and in some cases, it can induce a lot of emotions and feelings. And so the tools that we were trying to offer and provide is to be able to induce feelings of positivity, induce feelings of belonging. And in doing that, we found that it's been able to even help to minimize even some of the skeptics that might have emerged.
So I'm just going to read one comment that doesn't really need to be addressed, but I think does add to the conversation about shame. Our colleague Camilo Azcárate says that replacing shame guilt with responsibility toward the future could be a useful discussion as well. But I want to give the Matma Saxena her question. I think would be helpful to many people. And the question is, this is a great framework. What would you suggest as a starting point to implement this or begin to implement this at an institutional level?
John, go ahead.
Well, as a starting point, similar to what I've heard you talk about, Donna, I think there needs to be general orientation and building of shared language as an entry point, so that we all, when we use the word dignity, we know what we're talking about. Like you point out, it's different than respect, for instance. We need to be able to navigate that language. And so there needs to be a basic orientation, but then the next step in an organization is really working with leaders to ensure that we are actually taking action to move forward with inclusivity. part of my journey over the years is what I see often everywhere, which is what I believe is an overemphasis on awareness. Like you said, it becomes like this teaching endeavor where, but what we believe is that from a leadership frame, we can start right away with taking action, and that action can come in the form of assessing the climate. And in disaggregating our data in various ways where we're actually trying to figure out, are there patterns here manifesting within our organization that show that there are an entire group of people, no matter how we define that group. It could be job classification, it could have to do with identity factors, it could be anything. But is there a group feeling like they're on the margins, that they don't feel a sense of belonging, that's equivalent to other groups? And then from there, we can work on this whole problem exploration phase. And it really starts with the leaders getting out in front of it. But we always caution that, hey, just let's make sure that we have shared language. Floyd, what are your thoughts?
I think the other thing is just making sure that there's data. Similar to what John had been, saying, is that a lot of times where challenges emerge in terms of the first start is everyone wants to solve the macro problem. People want to drain the ocean and solve everything with one training. And that's just not going to happen. And so there's got to be constant assessment, both quantitative and qualitative, of how people belong. If we were talking about this in a corporate environment, how people belong within the corporate environment, and then talking to them to be able to identify if there are any things that need to be changed or addressed. But that's why it's so incredibly important to be able to focus on it at the leadership level, because frontline staff aren't going to be able to change the culture by themselves.
Right. Okay, we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Nicole Bryant, the Managing Director at PON, Program on Negotiation. And this is from Jamie Smith. Jamie wants to know, how do you envision this being applied on a systemic level?
On a systemic level, it can be applied. I think whenever we think about this, we have to think about it within the context of the governmental structure, of which we're a part. And that's part of the reason why these ideas of procedural justice wind up being discussed. I think if we were to consider so many of the protests that we see in whatever realm they might be, at the end of the day, the concern is that the governmental process itself isn't fair. That's what the concern is. And it doesn't matter what the particular governmental process is. We could talk about it in terms of voting. We could talk about it in terms of healthcare. We could talk about it in terms of whatever the case might be. And so the thing that we always continue to try to encourage as reminders of is that, as practitioners and as educators related to this work is that we have to continue to approach this work applying the same principles, that we're hoping to see as an outcome. As we continue to think about that over and over again, that's not always an easy thing to do. But when we can do that, we have a greater opportunity to be able to create more societies that we would like to see. And John and I've talked a lot over the past couple of days, especially since in the United States we've had election time, of again trying to find ways to not constantly ramp up the ongoing conflict, because there's not a good ending when it comes to that.
Well, Floyd Cobb and John Krownapple, thank you so very much for taking the time. I know you two are very busy, to talk to us about this profound issue. It's a human issue. These issues of dignity and belonging, equity, inclusion. This is a human problem that we're facing everywhere on the planet. And I just appreciate that you have done such a creative job putting together an alternative to thinking about how we can all belong in this one world. So thank you so much. And I'm going to now turn it over to Nicole Bryant for some updates on the PON schedule.
Yeah, thank you so much. And, Floyd and John, this is so inspiring. Thank you, Donna, for your leadership in this space and organizing the seminar. It's such a pleasure for the Program on Negotiation to partner with you on this. And thank you to all of our participants from really all over the world. It's astounding every time to see where you're coming in from. Just very quickly, I'm going to share some dates of programs that are, for really just being announced for the program on negotiation. This is our schedule of spring programs that are coming up from March to June of next year, virtual one-day programs. And you're seeing some of those names that we talked about today. So a full schedule of programs. Some of these are not even yet open for registration. I'm giving the sneak preview, but we hope to see you at future PON and Weatherhead Center events and at any of our trainings. Thank you so much for being a part of our community and for being here for this really inspiring discussion. We wish you all a really wonderful rest of your day. And again, the recording of this event with contact information will be shared in about a week on the Program on Negotiations website. Thanks to all of you. Be well, be safe, and we hope to see you again soon.